Our speaker today is Ed Sakwa. He's the CEO at the Emerge Center Against Domestic Abuse, Tucson's only comprehensive domestic violence service provider. He has served as Emerge's CEO since April of 2013, after serving the organization in various other capacities since 2008. A focus of the discussion will be some of the alarming developments in the law around accused domestic abusers' access to firearms under federal law and the Second Amendment. Ed graduated from Cholla High School here in Tucson, and then completed his undergraduate degree in marketing and business administration at the University of Arizona and Master of Business Administration at James Madison University. His 29-year tenure in human services includes work in the areas of domestic violence, youth development, and nonprofit grant making. He has served on numerous boards of directors and community committees, including the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, the Governor's Commission to Prevent Intimate, Partner, and Gender-Based Violence, and the Tucson-Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness. So let's give a warm Democrats of Greater Tucson and welcome to Ed Sakwa. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for having me here today. I appreciate when you take the time to look into some of these issues in our community that aren't always talked about as much. So I'm going to share my screen here, do a little PowerPoint. All right. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit, speaking a little bit broadly, and then kind of getting to this piece around the intersection of gun violence and domestic violence. But to start off just broadly, I want to share with you kind of how we define this topic of domestic violence. First of all, I'll say this is not a legal definition. This is not what Arizona statute says domestic violence is. This is not a law enforcement or criminal justice system definition. We're not really concerned. We are concerned, but in this piece of things, we are not concerned with whether people consider it, the state considers it to be illegal or not, but we're looking at the impacts on the human beings who are in this relationship. Also, I will say that we focus really heavily on intimate partner violence. There's, of course, broader definitions of domestic violence that includes familial violence, child abuse, etc. Of course, those are important things as well, and we have some organizations in town that work with those issues, but we're really focused on intimate partner violence. There's a particular dynamic that exists in that relationship that impacts the way that domestic violence plays out. So for us, we're looking at a pattern of coercive behavior that includes the use of tactics for the purpose of gaining power and control over another person. For me, the important pieces here are, first of all, we're talking about a pattern of behaviors. This is not a one-off situation. It's not that one time that this one thing happened. That might exist as well. But this, when we're talking about actual domestic violence situations, we're talking about a pattern existing. And that pattern doesn't exist for no reason. There's a purpose behind it. And we use the word tactics very intentionally. These are strategic, intentional means to an end. And in this case, the end is to gain power over our partner. And that can exist and manifest itself in a variety of ways. It might be physical abuse, which is sometimes the things we first think of when we hear the term domestic violence. We think of black eyes and bruises and broken bones. And that is, of course, unfortunately, a part of this. And there are sexual violence tactics used, and lots of psychological, mental, verbal, economic tactics that are used as well. And we could have a whole long conversation about why that is, what it looks like. We have limited time today and want to talk specifically about this piece around the intersection with gun violence, but I do want to say when we are talking about domestic violence, it does not look one way. And it's not something we often can see. That physical abuse piece, the black eyes, that is actually much more rare than is the psychological abuse. And the importance of that is to say we don't get to see that if we're not in the relationship. We don't have visibility to it. So if somebody walks into our home, into our office, and we see the black eye and the bruises, that might prompt us to ask something. But when it's not that, when it is not visible to people outside of the relationship, it makes it that much harder for anyone to offer help and for the victim in the situation to feel like they have support. And there's lots and lots of reasons why people can struggle to reach out for help around the fear and risk that they are put at if they were to tell anybody about it. So I say all of that to make sure that as we're thinking about it, we don't assume that just because we don't physically see something, it means that it's not existing for that person. That there are many people around us who are experiencing this and we never have a clue. And to that end, just to kind of put a scope on this thing that we're talking about, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. And I want to pause and say, you're going to hear me talk a lot about this in terms of women being the victims, men being the abusive partner, and want to clarify a few things. First of all, the fact that we talk about it often in that way is not to suggest that men are not victims of domestic violence. Absolutely, that occurs. We serve those folks here at Emerge. It is not to suggest that it does not happen in same-sex relationships at the same rates that it does in heterosexual relationships. In fact, it often happens at higher rates. The reason we talk about it this way is not because those other things are not a part of the puzzle here. It's because the vast, vast, vast majority of domestic violence is male violence against women. And we just have to be real about that. We have to acknowledge the truth of it and then work from there. And so please, as I speak about this, do not think this means that we don't believe men are victims or that women use abusive behaviors. Absolutely, that's the case. But it is far and away a male violence against women issue. There's a gender-based violence issue here, and we have to be willing to talk about that. That said, I want to also be really clear. When we talk about men being the primary perpetrators of domestic violence, that is not the same as saying all men are abusive. There's a big difference between all men are abusive and most people who use abusive behaviors are men. The way that we often kind of look at it is if the distance between my hands here is all men, there's really this small minority of men who are using abusive behaviors with their partner. Again, that makes up most of who is doing it, but it's still this little minority of men. So what we often talk about is we've got to work with that small group of men, but we also have to be willing to talk about what about the rest of us men who aren't doing that, but see this happening. And are we using our voice to address that or not? And what I would argue is that by and large, we don't. Us men who are not using abusive behaviors see it playing out regularly with our buddies, our sons, our fathers, our brothers, our uncles, our neighbors, our coworkers. But there is a lot of socialization that tells us we're not supposed to get in another guy's business. It's the bro code. It says that we as men do not get in other men's business. And what it means is there's a lot of men using abusive behaviors that don't have anybody challenging them other than their partner, perhaps. So again, that's a whole nother conversation, but I just want to kind of plant that seed to say there's a big role for men in helping to hold other men accountable, helping other men to get help when they are using abusive behaviors. That said, 1 in 4 women are going to experience domestic violence primarily at the hands of men. And when you think about that number, 1 in 4 women, and you think about people you know in your life, that's a lot of people. who are experiencing this. The other way to look at that is all of us have mothers. So if 1 in 4 women are victims, that means 1 in 4 of us have mothers that are victims, grew up in homes where domestic violence was taking place. This is something that impacts the entire community. There are lots of stereotypes out there about who perpetrates domestic violence. There's kind of this belief system that it's lower income folks, etc. It's just not the case. It happens across the community in all demographic categories. It happens just as much in the foothills as anywhere else in town. The difference might be that people in the foothills may have the financial capacity, victims may have the financial capacity to go get another place to live, go to a hotel room. Whereas people who don't have income, when they're in that situation, they need to come to a place like Emerge's shelter. So we disproportionately serve low-income folks, but the breadth and depth of what happens in terms of domestic violence in relationships is absolutely across the board. We at Emerge, as the only comprehensive, dedicated domestic violence program in town, we serve 6,000 domestic violence survivors and their children every year. And we know that that 6,000 is the tip of the iceberg. Part of the way we know that is that Pima County Sheriff's Department and TPD combined receive about 15,000 911 calls for domestic violence each year. That doesn't even include Oro Valley, Marana, Sarita, all those kind of outlying areas. TPD and the Sheriff's Department, 15,000 911 calls for domestic violence. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole lot of forms and manifestations of domestic violence that are psychological and verbal and economic that aren't against the law, meaning you can't call 911 for help around that. So when you take the 15,000 and realize that's just people who can call the police around what's happening to them, that's just people who are willing to call the police, who aren't too scared to call the police, who feel comfortable with the police. And there's a lot of research that shows that only 1 in 10 instances get reported. And there's lots of reasons for that. Fear, and not paranoia fear, but experience-based fear of what will happen to them if they were to report it. So then you take these numbers, the 6,000 we serve, the 15,000 911 calls, and you think, well, that's only 1 in 10. You start doing the math here and you can see just how huge this is in our community. And unfortunately, every year we see far too many murders and murder-suicides related to domestic violence. And if you track news in any way, it doesn't take long to hear the story about that person who was murdered and then come to find out it was a partner. Also, I forget the exact statistic now off the top of my head, but a huge portion of mass shootings, the person has killed their partner as part of that. They've obviously gone on to kill others as well, but there's a domestic violence root to many mass shootings as well. Very quickly, just want to tell you about some of the services that we provide before we kind of move on to the gun conversation here. We try to provide services that are as comprehensive as possible, knowing that we're kind of it in town for services that are designed specifically for domestic violence survivors. So we have an emergency shelter that's available that is meant for people who are at great risk of physical danger, lethality. Obviously, I have a significant typo here, but I was supposed to say can be life or death situations when people are fleeing violence in that moment. And then we've got a 24/7 multilingual hotline that people can call when they're in crisis, when they're just contemplating what's happening. They don't have to be distraught in that moment. We sometimes use that word crisis line and people feel like if I'm not crying at the moment, I can't reach out. That is not the case. This is for people who just have any kind of questions, concerns, need support of any kind in relation to domestic violence. We have community-based services that are kind of like outpatient equivalents that people make appointments for, that provide case management, legal support, support groups, safety planning, things of that nature, a small housing program. We have services specifically for children, services for mothers or fathers if they are the victim, and how to support their children through this kind of trauma happening in their home. And then we also work with men. Again, knowing that men are make up the majority of those who are using the abusive behaviors in their relationships, we want to get to the root. This is our prevention work, trying to intervene in a way that prevents future violence. So we have classes that are for men to be able to kind of re-look at their own history, their own what they learned growing up, what belief systems they formed, and ways that that might shift their behaviors. Coming hopefully in a couple of months, we're developing a helpline that men who feel like they are imminently going to use violence in their relationship can reach out to the helpline and talk to another man to kind of talk themselves down from taking that action. We work with those who are court ordered and on probation as well. And then we're just out in the community talking about the issue and talking to men and boys about what healthy masculinity looks like and how we can be safer for women in our lives. So that's kind of an overview of Emerge. I'll then share a little bit here about this gun issue, and then we can certainly open it up to conversation and questions, but I'll just pause here a moment before we talk about that very specific issue. Any questions on the broader piece here?
I was wondering, how many men do you get that are in a violent situation? I know there are gay couples and even straight couples where the man has the problem being threatened.
Yep.
How many men do you get usually?
Not a lot, I have to say. It's a very small percentage. It's about 5% of who we serve. I think part of the issue there, it's just not as prevalent. That's just part of the reality. But when it does occur, in addition to all the other reasons that women might not come forward, including again that fear piece, and shame and guilt that women can feel, male victims often feel that piece tenfold. There is this belief that men are supposed to be in charge. They are supposed to be strong. There's, the idea that a woman could hurt them, gets at the very core of what we are taught to be shameful about as men. And so the idea that they might come forward asking for help and have to admit that it's a woman who is being abusive to them really limits the times that those folks reach out. You mentioned certainly in same-sex relationships it occurs, and we do have folks who reach out around that. But again, I think even if it is another man who is abusing them, it doesn't change the socialization that we have as men that say you're not that would be admitting weakness in some way, and so we shouldn't come forward. So it certainly exists out there, but it is unfortunately limited in terms of folks reaching out.
Okay, we have a question from Andrea Kennedy for you.
Yes.
Well, I had a couple of things. Why should the victim leave? Why doesn't the abuser go somewhere else? That's my first thought. The other thought I had was when I was married, my husband was a counselor, and he was working with a group of women who were in abusive relationships. And he said to me, they were talking about how sometimes they do stuff that they know will trigger their husbands into the violent behavior. And I thought about this, and I thought, why would they do something such a threat to their safety? And then I figured it out. If you do this, you are in some way prepared. You have some control. You're sort of forewarned. Maybe you can get the kids, out of the house or something. And then afterwards, he's nice for a while. but it's just a thought. I don't know if you have any comments on it. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. First, on your first point, I want to say, we often have a lot of conversations out in the community about victims leaving. And often the question is, why don't they leave? Like, what's wrong with her? Why would she stay in that situation? And there's a whole conversation we could have if we had the time about why that is, but I will summarize it to say there are many very logical reasons why people stay in abusive relationships, to include that piece around that the fear that is rooted in reality, to include there's been research done that says the greatest risk of physical injury or harm comes to people as they are leaving or once they have left the relationship versus when they are in it. And that's twisted. And it's hard to wrap our heads around the fact that people sometimes are actually safer in the relationship than out of it, because leaving it doesn't mean the violence stops. In fact, it often causes it to escalate. So there's that piece of the conversation. But we always preface that by saying, and this is the wrong question to be asking. If we want to ask it, there's a good answer for it, but it is the wrong question. The real question isn't why does she stay? It's why doesn't he stop? And so to your point, victims often say to us, like, yeah, I don't want to have to leave my home. I don't want to take my kids out of my home. Why should I have to be the one to leave, potentially, if I don't have resources, go into a shelter and start from zero because something that somebody else did to me? Why isn't it the person who's doing the wrong thing have those consequences? And it's a great question that does not have a great answer. It is the harsh reality sometimes of how power and control plays out. In terms of the second question, I'm sure that occurs. I think that, what you said about sometimes having control over when and where things happen plays out for people. That said, we don't hear from a lot of folks that they use that approach to survive, that it's usually more so that his triggers can be damn near anything. And so the fact that she did something that triggered him could mean that she was breathing. It could mean that she walked into a room. And it really more isn't about what she is or isn't doing, but what excuses he gives himself to use those tactics. All right, I see a hand up from Mike Humphrey.
I had Mike Humphrey. I'm with the Pima County Board of Health and also a member of St. Philip's. And so I want to ask you a question and then ask a favor.
Yeah.
Question is, are you going to talk about, I got into this conversation late, are you going to talk about gun use in domestic violence? Like how many of these events include a firearm?
Yes.
That's my question. And the second ask is, we distribute your shoe cards at our church in the bathroom so that women and men can go in there, go in the restrooms and your cards are in there. We have like little baskets where they can get your cards.
Yeah.
Can we get more cards from you?
Absolutely.
Should I just come by?
I'll put my contact information up here at the end, and you can either shoot me an email. We can connect offline to make sure that gets to the right person. Or if there's a person at the church or anywhere else, I'll just say this broadly for all of you, on our website, emergecenter.org, there's a place to request materials. And you can get posters or these little shoe cards that Mike's referring to sent out to you. So either way, that will work.
Thanks, Ed.
Absolutely. All right. Any other questions before we move on? I do see one in the chat about is Emerge connected to Sakwa. We are different organizations, but we absolutely work closely together and collaborate. One, because there's a connection. Sometimes the form of domestic violence is sexual in nature. And so there's an intersection between our work there. But also Sakwa works with us. They have sexual assault nurse examiners who do forensic exams on sexual assaults. Those same nurses do strangulation exams in domestic violence situations to get forensic information in support of that. So yes, we work closely with Sakwa. let's move to the gun piece. So we have some time for that. I'm sure that will spark a lot more conversation as well. And I will tell you, this is something we as an organization historically struggled to talk about because there's so much politicalization of guns, the idea of gun ownership and gun rights and gun control and all of that. And I want to say we as an organization do not have a stance on gun control per se. Broadly, I will say that lots of us who work here have very strong feelings personally about it. But our, as an organization, our focus is not on whether people do or do not get to own guns. It is about what they get to do with them and who gets to have them. So I'll kind of walk through that. So when it comes to domestic violence, and here's that the third one. Here's the statistic I was trying to remember a moment ago. Nearly half of mass shootings where 4+ people are killed, the perpetrator shot an intimate partner or family member as part of that shooting. The risk of being killed by an intimate partner increases 500%, fivefold, if their partner owns a gun. That's a critical one for us to hold on to here. That in that situation where there may or may not be physical violence or physical assault, but there is control, manipulation and control through tactics. If that partner owns a gun, the risk of being killed just jumped 5 times. 2/3 of women who are killed by their intimate partner are killed by a gun. That is the primary means by which women are killed by their partner. And it's 70 a month on average that are killed by a gun. That's nationally. In Arizona specifically, with the most recent year we have data for, there were 101 people killed by incidents of domestic violence. 3/4 of those were gun deaths. And our state has one of the highest rates of women being killed by men in the country. And here in Tucson, again, not the most recent years, data usually lags significantly, but you can still get the point here that in a 1-year span, firearm-related homicides increased by 58%. We have a gun issue. We have a gun violence issue in this community, and particularly as it relates to domestic violence. So I want to share with you the story of Zaki Rahimi. And you all may be familiar with this, or you may not. And I am going to, for a moment, stop sharing my PowerPoint so I can pull up this document to read this to you real quick. So here's a summary of what happened with Mr. Rahimi. In December of 2019, Zaki Rahimi and his girlfriend got into an argument in a parking lot. This is in Texas. During that fight, he knocked his girlfriend to the ground, dragged her into his car, and shoved her inside. When he realized that a bystander was watching, he pulled out a gun and fired a shot at the person. The girlfriend was able to run away. He later called her, threatened to shoot her if she ever told anybody what happened. The girlfriend pursued a restraining order. A Texas judge issued a 2-year restraining order against him, found that he had committed family violence and that such violence was likely to occur again in the future, and as part of the order, suspended Mr. Rahimi's handgun license. Mr. Rahimi then decided to defy the court order. In August of 2020, he reached out to his girlfriend on social media and later went to her house in the middle of the night. A few months later, he threatened another woman with a gun, leading to his arrest on charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. This is all while this restraining order and license suspension is in effect. He then separately bought drugs from somebody who started talking trash, quote unquote, online, and he fired an AR-15 at the man's house. The next day, during a traffic crash, he shot at a driver, the other driver in the crash. Then separately, he fired a gun into the air in a residential neighborhood 3 days later. And then separately, a few weeks after that, after a truck flashed its headlights at him, he followed the truck and shot at the driver. And then a few weeks or months later, he fired shots into the air after his friend's credit card was declined at a Whataburger. That's Mr. Rahimi. So what happened was he has now taken this restriction of his ability to have guns due to conviction of domestic violence charges all the way to the Supreme Court. It has now been heard at the Supreme Court, and we're awaiting what their decision is going to be about this broader question of, do people who have convictions of domestic violence charges and or have domestic violence orders of protection or restraining orders issued against them, do they have the continued right to own firearms? And essentially what is at debate here from a legal standpoint is, on one hand, you've got the Second Amendment. On the other hand, and this is me, not anybody arguing it at the Supreme Court, but my personal take on it is that, on the other hand, you have the preamble to the Declaration of Independence that says we have an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So another way of saying it is, okay, there's a legal right constitutionally to own guns, but there's also a basic human right to not being killed. And the question becomes, if somebody has proven themselves to be a danger to others, is there a limit then to their Second Amendment right? And as you can imagine, the debate is fierce over this. And there's a lot of folks on who support the NRA who would say that it's a slippery slope, and that if you take gun rights from anybody for any reason, it's going to lead to the end of the Second Amendment. And you got folks on the other hand saying, but can we be reasonable here and say that even if you get to generally have the right to own arms, does that mean that every human being can have them in every circumstance, even when they're dangerous? And one of the things that was really interesting that came up is when this went to I think it was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the reason that it was originally said that, nope, you cannot, this man's rights to firearms cannot be taken away. Mr. Rahimi has a right to firearms. The legal argument was, back at the time that the Constitution was created, was there a comparable law or a comparable belief that said that guns could be taken away from people? And if that didn't exist back then it can't exist now. It can't be legal to do now. And there's a lot of flawed thinking in that. There's a lot of things that the founders could not have even imagined, let alone been able to consider in the context of their times, that might exist today. And that includes the view of domestic violence, the belief that women are not property, the belief that women are whole people, the belief that women have equal rights. None of that was in place back then. And so to try to draw that as the basis for whether laws can be implemented today creates a lot of problems, at least in the context of domestic violence. So that, and I just say, if you're interested in this topic, there are some groups out there that really kind of speak much more eloquently and expertly than I can about this intersection of guns and domestic violence. And that would be a group called Everytown and a group called Moms Demand Action. And those can be found easily on the web. So that's what I have available to share, and just want to use that to prompt a conversation about this issue. And I know that when Mike and I were talking about this conversation today, there was certainly some interest from even just a legal standpoint of, what this means for us in society and constitutionally. So as we're doing that, just leave this up here for a few seconds if people want our contact information. But other than that, happy to get into the conversation here.
So, okay, Mike Humphrey has a question.
Ed, thanks for the introduction. It almost like blends perfectly into the question I'm going to ask you. Can we identify how many prohibited possessors are involved in gun-related domestic violence
That is a great
in
question.
Pima County?
Yeah, it's a great question. I absolutely do not have the answer to that. And beyond that, I'm not sure if anybody does or not. I will actually try to get the answer to that, though, and funnel it back through Mike Bryan and try to get y'all that answer. I do know that the folks most likely to have that information will be the Pima County Attorney's Office, or we work really closely with within Tucson City Court. There is a specialty court called Domestic Violence Court, led by Judge Wendy Million, and she and Emerge worked very closely on a grant that we received from the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. It's called the Firearm Technical Assistance Grant, and it is intended to help our community understand better and do better in regards to how firearms are dealt with within domestic violence situations. Because part of the issue is, even when there is an order to say that somebody can no longer own firearms, that does nothing because there's no enforcement to it. There's no teeth behind it. There's nobody checking to see, did that guy really turn over his guns? And if he doesn't, what's going to happen about it? And is law enforcement willing to go out and actually force the issue and create tremendous danger for their officers in doing so? There's that's all to say. There's an effort to better strengthen our system around that. And I don't know whether they have that particular statistic or not, but it's a really good point about how often this is occurring and can we track who it is.
And the reason I ask, and I won't dominate the conversation anymore, but the reason I'm asking is that we're trying to build a case here locally that we need to enforce straw purchase laws more rigorously with using local police and not depending on the ATF, which does not really go after straw. But the case would be made that that's how prohibited possessors are getting these firearms, or from these straw purchasers. One of the ways. We know they steal other things, but they also get them from straw purchasing. So if you can help us, I'd love to work with you on this. And if we can put together a case locally, how this is all coming about in terms of domestic violence and the firearms use, who's using them and where are they getting them, it helps us build this bigger case about trying to go after these folks that are arming these criminals and these domestic abusers.
Yes, absolutely. Would love to work with you on that.
Okay, well, Mike Bryan has a couple of questions. Does the NRA actually have a position or filed an amicus brief in Rahimi?
I do not know. I'm going to be real honest with you. My knowledge base is much more about the after effects than it is about the legal case in this particular situation. So I do not know the answer to that.
Yeah, so far as I can see, they don't have one at this time, but I wouldn't be surprised if that does occur at some point. But it's post-argument, so I don't see any point in them lodging one now. I did have something else in the question in the
pandemic related.
No. Yeah, that was just a speculation on my part that the big increase between 2019 and 20 might have something to do with everybody being stuck at home.
I will just say that there was an interesting impact with the pandemic. There was this twofold outcome that we could see. Everything that we could CDC told us that violence was increasing during the pandemic.
Yeah.
At the same time, the number of people reaching out to Emerge plummeted dramatically during the pandemic. As we talked to the people who did reach out to us, trying to understand the phenomenon here, the best we could piece together is it really did have to be with everybody being at home. Because the thing is, with other forms of violence that happen out in the community, you go to your house, you lock the door, and that's how you try to create safety for yourself. Yeah. In a domestic violence situation, when you are at home and you lock the door, you are locking the abuse in with you. The danger is locked in with you. So when everybody's at home because, either closures of things or people were working from home more frequently, obviously still are, it meant the abusive partner was at home with them. Yeah. So that A, increased the opportunity for abuse to happen, but B, dramatically removed the availability for the victim to reach out for help. Because in the past, they might have reached out when they went to work or when their partner left home and went to work. And now none of that was happening. And so we saw very few people being able to reach out. The ones who did said, yeah, it was a lot harder for me to find a way to connect with you all. But meanwhile, the incidents of abuse were up significantly. So yeah, there was a real dramatic impact of the pandemic on people trying to survive domestic violence.
Yeah, child abuse as well, because there weren't those mandatory reporters of teachers saying to kids every day.
Exactly, who did not have eyes on in the same way. Yep.
I'm going to ask you in a minute a question in the chat that Karen Gleason had, which leads into tax credits and how we can help support Emerge. But first, I'd like to talk to you about lethality factors. Those aspects of a domestic violence incident that police investigators look for to indicate that things are escalating and the potential for lethality in that relationship are going up. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So first I'll say that being physically abused is not the only indicator of lethality. In other words, people can be in a relationship and experiencing no form of physical abuse and then be killed in that relationship. That's important to know. Secondly, I will say that we in Pima County have really been, and I mean the network of DV response, which includes Emerge, but also includes prosecutors, both city and county, law enforcement, probation, et cetera, have done a really good job. It's one of the few areas I can say around trying to identify lethality risks. There were some professors, one at ASU, one at NAU, who worked on a tool called APPRAISE, which stands for Arizona Intimate Partner Risk Assessment Instrument System, which was a long way of trying to make sure that the abbreviation was APPRAISE. That is just that. It is an evidence-based, research-based tool of what seem to be the predictors of serious injury or death in a domestic violence relationship. And that tool is now used throughout the state of Arizona by law enforcement when they respond to a DV call to assess the risk. The difference in Pima County versus other parts of the state is that everywhere else, that tool is just given to the results of that assessment are just given to judges for use in things like conditions of release. But in Pima County, it is also used to connect people to services. And so when that law enforcement officer conducts that assessment and the result says this person is at elevated or high risk of lethality, they then immediately, upon the victim's wishes, they are not forced to obviously, connect that person to Emerge's hotline. On the scene, they will hand them the police will hand them their phone if the victim does not have one, to get them immediately connected. We in turn prioritize services to that person to make sure that they can get shelter, etc., even if we're full otherwise, we will prioritize bringing them in because of that assessment. We then also use that assessment for people who call our hotline outside of law enforcement, and the other areas of the response system use that as well. So all to say, we as a community are much more focused on this than others around the state and the country. Then, to answer your specific question, the things that have been identified in that risk assessment tend to be things like the existence of weapons in the home, i.e. the gun piece. It tends to be things like strangulation is a huge indicator of future lethality. Things like threats to kill. So, the idea, there's certainly many times threats are used just as threats, ways to create fear for people and as a result have them do what you want them to do. But the reality is too that sometimes those threats are actually legit and they are an actual warning and that people follow through with it. Those are the three real biggies. There are some others as well, but those are big. And I'll just quickly spend another second talking about strangulation because it is far more prevalent than people think. It is often hard to diagnose or see. There are, we want to think that there's always going to be these big bruises left on the person's neck. And of course, sometimes that occurs, but often it is not because there are many other ways to cut off somebody's airflow. And it is not always done in a way that leaves marks, but it is done frequently, unfortunately. And when that is a tactic that is used, very often that leads to attempts to kill. So those are some of the biggies that we see are kind of predictors.
Yeah, that tool is also very useful for prosecutors. As a former DV prosecutor in Wendy Million's courtroom for the city, I can tell you that strongly affects a prosecutor's response to the issue as well, and can prompt us to ask for a removal of firearms. I can tell you that in Rahimi, one of the issues is whether or not a process existed historically in order to remove firearms from people who are considered dangerous by the community. And one of the big issues I think that will emerge from that is the standards of proof applied at such a hearing. Currently, that's basically a civil hearing. The standards of proof used, if that order is contested, is civil in nature, and the finding of dangerousness is basically preponderance of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas historically, that sort of firearm removal would be a criminal process with all the protections and warnings and standards of proof that implies.
Mm-hmm.
And that would make definitely the job of courts and prosecutors a whole heck of a lot harder in order to remove those firearms from people who have been deemed to be most dangerous and most at risk of lethality to their partners in the community. Bill Swan asked,
so in your experience, that piece that I was mentioning of implementation of the removal, what does that look like from your experience in terms of there's an order for that person to be banned from owning firearms, but how often is the follow-up effective?
It strongly depends on the court. It really does. Oftentimes, what will happen is the court will order the police to report on whether or not the perpetrator, the accused, actually comes into a police station and turns in their firearms within a certain period of time. And then if they don't, they can follow up on that or not. In many, many cases, unfortunately, the answer to that is not. Yeah. So that is something that we need to do better in our justice system, and that judges should be much, 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 much more aggressive in. But they will become even more reticent to do that portion of protecting the public should the standards of proof change around that dangerousness assessment.
Yeah.
Bill Swan asks, how will this show up in the coming Arizona elections as we knock on doors? I assume he means like the issue of gun safety and lethality in general.
I am not a political operative, so I will. I'll try to walk a thin line here, but I think that when you're knocking on doors, trying to connect people to candidates or issues, I think that it's always important to make sure that folks know about the things they're not readily already getting information about. Meaning, if they already know about, people know about abortion, they know about where things stand, they know what the Supreme Court decision was, they know what it means here in Arizona. If they care about abortion at all, they know about the abortion issue. It's got lots and lots of media coverage. Whether all of it's factual or not is another story, but there's lots about it. This kind of thing, what kind of things are happening to domestic violence survivors, the ways that their safety may be dramatic. The way I see it is, you can take the statistics and do some pretty easy math to say if the ability to prohibit folks convicted of domestic violence or have an order of protection against them, that the ability to remove firearms from their home is taken away, people will die as a result of that decision.
Oh yeah.
It's just simple math.
Yeah.
There will be blood on hands as a result of that. So I think that's the kind of thing that has real significant impact in our community. People in our community will die. Could be our friends, family, neighbor, coworkers. And it's not something that's going to be talked about like the abortion issue, for example. So long way of saying, I think that there's some benefit to getting people activated, interested in being involved, even if that's just the act of going out and voting versus sitting home and not, is to, get them fired up around some of the things they don't already know they need to be fired up around.
Yeah, I think there's not a lot of wide scale public awareness of the fact that lethality for women goes way up when there's a gun involved, and second, that statistical connection between public violence and private violence. The fact that the vast majority of people who go out and commit a terroristic act against their community with a gun spree, mass murder, have domestic violence in their past in one way or another, and often it is the spree itself is triggered by a domestic violence situation. Yeah, I think that's not well understood or that hasn't penetrated public consciousness as much as it certainly should.
Yeah.
Joe, we have a couple hands up.
Yeah, we've got Susie Anderson and then Andrea Kennedy.
Well, I was wondering now if you can, the courts of appeals. Okay, there are 9 districts. Am I correct?
9 circuits, yeah.
9 circuits. Okay, so each of those has a different mixture. Can you change the circuit that hears your case?
No, depends on what state you're in, and that's defined by Congress. Which state that the 5th Circuit that the Rahimi case is from is quite conservative.
So Rahimi could have been adjudicated differently had it been heard by a different circuit court.
Sure.
The question is, how lethal is the emotional abuse when there is no physical abuse in a relationship? I mean, that to me, that is at least as damaging when you've got an emotional abuser. And how can you reach out to those women or men?
Yeah. I think that's the other piece I was trying to emphasize at the beginning, was to say there's what we can see and then there's what's happening. And I think, what we can see is literally the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more emotional, psychological, verbal, economic abuse that occurs than physical. And the physical is really important, obviously, because of the way that it can harm people, the risk of death. But as I was saying, you can go straight from emotional abuse to murder as well. And it really comes down to tactics, which is if I'm trying to control my partner and I'm using these non-physical ways to do it and it stops working, in theory, some people are going to take what we might consider a progression to physical abuse before we would think about somebody killing somebody, but that's not always the case. That's some kind of logic, and logic is not necessarily applicable here. So there's that piece, that the risk of somebody is still there. But to your bigger point, absolutely, if we're talking about the impact, many of the survivors that we work with tell us the long-term damage from emotional abuse is far greater than the physical, because the bruises fade, the broken bones heal, but what really sticks with them and impacts them psychologically is the fact that this person that they love and believes loved them would intentionally do these things to them, would intentionally manipulate them, be coercive with them, be degrading to them, objectify them, all the things that might take place, intentionally isolate them from other people, intentionally break down their esteem of themselves, etc. Like the fact that this person that I love would do that to me is the big long-term damage. So yes, it can be devastating. And because there's a thin line where often part of the emotional abuse is to create fear that there will be physical abuse. If you do this thing I don't want you to do, I'm going to hit you. I'm going to hurt the kids. I'm going to hurt your parents. I'm going to hurt the pet. I'm going to get you deported. I'm going to out you. I'm going to, like, on and on and on and on. The threat of doing something harmful is the method of control. And so there's a thin line between all of that too.
Yeah. Whereas I think there's certainly no socioeconomic or class distinction between, for the rate at which domestic abuse occurs. Mm-hmm. I find that the higher your education, the higher your IQ, the higher your income, the more tools and tactics you have available in order to do the abuse short of physical coercion. So that is a factor, and you do see a difference amongst perpetrators that way. Okay,
Susie, you had a quick question?
Well, just a follow-up. How many of the abused turn around and annihilate their partners?
It's a very small percentage, but it is one that is largely misunderstood. And if we could have another hour, I would talk to you about a case we have right here in Tucson, where a woman who killed her abusive partner is being charged with premeditated murder. And there is a whole lot to that story, to include previous interactions of law enforcement in that situation that were grossly mishandled. And so all that said, it is rare that it occurs, but it does occur. And not to say that there aren't times where a woman might just commit murder like anybody else does. But when it's in these situations, it is predominantly an issue of self-defense and or survival in some kind of way.
Yeah. Great. So Ed, can you talk about Arizona tax credits and how that can benefit 501c3s like Emerge?
Yes. And I'll speak quick because I know we're out of time, but Emerge is a nonprofit organization. We certainly receive government funding, but we rely on the community support in order to exist. And I'll also tell you that due to some federal disinvestment that is coming our way in October around victims of crime and services for them, we are expecting close to a $700,000 cut from the feds. That if we don't want services to be cut in equal measure, we're going to have to rely on our community to fill that gap. And that means we need folks to support and whether that's a big dollar amount or a small dollar amount, it all matters. but the Arizona tax credit can be a huge piece of this, where individuals and couples can give and have the state pay for it. If you, and I am not a tax expert, please talk to your tax expert before you do anything instead of doing it based on what I'm about to say. But here's the gist of it. The gist is that if you have at least a $400 tax obligation, that you as an individual can give $400 to an organization like Emerge and get a $400 credit on your taxes, state taxes, not a deduction, but an actual credit. So it's a dollar for dollar getting that money back from the state. So it's essentially as if the state made the donation. For couples, it can be up to $800. So it is a really good way for you. If you confront the state by paying the $400 now, you will get that $400 back as part of the credit. And so it is a really easy way to help an organization like Emerge, and hope folks will consider taking advantage of that.
Yeah. And just as a reminder for everybody, Emerge is at www.emerge.org. I encourage you to visit their website, and they have all kinds of information and resources there.
Okay, well, what a great program, Ed.
I misspoke. Let me re-speak. EmergeCenter.org. Thank you, Ed, for
Okay, there you go. Ed, your commitment and your passion for what you do comes across so clearly, and we're so lucky to have you and your staff doing all the good work to prevent this abuse.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate y'all having me here, and again, taking time to make sure that you've got a handle on the issue, so you can then go out and spread that word and hopefully have it impact some decisions that are made here in the community when we go to vote.
Very good.